Okay, so in between finishing the last recording and starting this one, I had a bit of a think about the way we're going to take this project forward, and I made two decisions really. The first one is, rather than do some learning and then work on mini projects, what we're going to do is we're just going to work on one big project. So we'll do some learning and then we'll go and apply what we've learned to that project. At the time of this recording, I'm thinking either software as a service or e-commerce, but I've still not totally made my mind up on that. The other thing I'm thinking is that rather than use PDO like we did in the first course, we're going to do something which is more typical of what will be used in the industry, and we're going to use something called DoctrineORM. ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping, and basically what that means is you're creating objects, classes which map to tables in the database. Choose high definition for the best viewing experience, and if you'd like to join a growing group of software developers and take your skills to a new level, all you need to do is subscribe, click the little notification icon, and welcome. So it's a bit of a pain, but what I decided to do was, because we're making these changes, start a new project. To get up to speed and to get to where I am at, all you need to do is copy my composer.json file, which you see here, pulls in various pieces, file dumper and PHPUnit, which we did in the first recording, and then also we've got these new ones here, which the main one is DoctrineORM. Okay, and then once we've done that, we're going to go over to the Doctrine Documentation, and we're just going to grab some code from there, which we'll use in a bootstrap file, and then I'll talk you through how we're going to take it forward from there. So let's start off by pulling in these dependencies. I've called my project BTB-project. Okay, and so over to the terminal, and in the root of that project I have my composer.json file. It's the only file I have in there at the moment. So composer, and then install, and this will install all of those things, so that should take a second. Okay, great stuff. So let's go and check out our vendor folder, and there we go, there's all our dependencies. I do tell a lie, I have one other folder in there, and that is an SQL folder, and we have the user SQL that we looked at in the previous lesson. So in this one, we're not actually going to be creating the user table directly like using SQL here. We'll use the entities, and we use something called Annotations. And what we do is we run a command from the command line, and that will read an entity file. So we'll have a user class with various properties. It'll read that class and actually create a table in the database from that. So all clever stuff, you'll get to see that shortly. First off though, we need to just nip over to the Doctrine Documentation and grab some code, some configuration. Okay, so this is the doctrineproject.org website, and we're just going to grab some code from the getting started part. I'd recommend you have a read of this if you've not used Doctrine before. Maybe work through this little tutorial, and then you'll have a good idea more of how it works. My lesson isn't going to be a Doctrine lesson per se. I'm going to show you how we can achieve what we want to achieve with Doctrine, but if you want to go into it in more depth, then this is the place to go. And so it tells you what is Doctrine. It explains it's an object relational mapper, so you're mapping PHP objects to tables in the database. And a good thing about it is that this creates that separation, so your code, you don't have to write code which is specific to MySQL or Postgres or Oracle. You just simply write PHP code in your config, tell Doctrine which database you're using, and Doctrine will actually convert your PHP code into either Oracle SQL or Postgres SQL or MySQL. So really clever, really portable, and it means you're not tied into using just one database vendor. Okay, so as you can see here, project setup, we've already got these parts here. We've pulled in DoctrineORM and Symfony YAML, even though I'm not sure we're going to be using Symfony YAML. But the bit we're looking for here that we're going to copy is this bootstrap file, and what this does is it does all the configuration. It's going to, if you see this line here, it's going to tell Doctrine to use annotations to create the metadata, and it reads that metadata to create the tables and to read and write from the tables. Okay, so all good stuff. Copy that, then back over to our project, and then in the project root just create a file called bootstrap.php. So bootstrap.php. In fact, I don't need to put .php because it's creating a PHP file anyway. And then I'm just going to paste that in there. Okay, so I'll talk you through some of this. So the setup is a class which is used to do the configuration of Doctrine. Entity manager, that's we're going to create an entity manager object actually in this file, and then we'll be able to use that in all files which require or include this one. And the entity manager is the object which reads and writes to and from the database and handles all the persistence. So auto load, you know all about that. We're using the Composer autoloader. Here we're saying that we're in dev mode, so maybe later on in this course we'll actually switch from hard coding stuff like this to using environment variables where we're reading variables from the server. Okay, proxy directory cache, not too sure about both of those things. Use simple annotation reader. This is just some default configuration. This next line though, this is important because what this is doing is it's telling Doctrine to use annotations for metadata configuration, and we're also passing in some config into that to help set that up. Okay, and so what that means is we don't need these next couple of commented out lines because they are for if you want to use XML for your metadata configuration or YAML for your metadata configuration. We won't be using those. And then we come down to here. So the default is an SQLite setup, but we're not going to use an SQLite setup. We are actually going to connect to a MySQL database. And so what we'll do is we'll put the config in here now, and then we'll go over and actually create the database that we're going to use. So I've had a practice earlier on and I figured out my config, so I'm just going to go and copy and paste this and update it from another file. Okay, so I'll paste that in there. So the driver will be PDO MySQL, so it's using PDO for MySQL under the hood. Our user, I'm just going to have a username of root. Password, I'm going to leave blank. It's not going to be BTB practice, we're actually going to call this BTB project. And then the host will be 127.0.0.1, i.e. localhost. And then this is where the entity manager is created, and so this is what we'll use in all files, which include this one. Okay, so I'm over on Table Plus, and just to show you my MySQL connection, I can call it what I want, but the main thing we're looking at is the host, and that of course matches the host that I'm using in my Bootstrap file. What else we're looking at? Port 3306, which is pretty standard for MySQL. User is root, okay, so that matches, and password I left blank, and so this is all good. We can connect to this, and then I just need to go and actually create a new database. So on this little thing here, I'm just going to click this little plus, and we said it's called BTB project. So BTB, by the way, stands for Beyond the Basics. I think you probably know that by now. And the encoding, it's the one I actually want is UTF-8MB4, and then it'll fill in the other bit for me. Click OK, and then I'm just going to open that. And so I have an empty database, no tables in there yet, because the tables, as we said, is going to be when we create that entity file for our user. We'll run a command from the console, and then magically it will create a table from reading our PHP, which is pretty cool. What do we need to do next? Let's have a look at the Doctrine documentation. And so it says here, generating the database schema. Doctrine has a command line interface that allows you to access the schema tool, a component that can generate a relational database schema based entirely on the defined entity classes and their metadata. For this to work, a CLI-config PHP file must exist in the project root directory. Okay, so let's create one of those. We need to copy this, go over to our project, and then we're going to, I think it's called CLI, let's have another read of that, CLI config. And then we'll paste that in there, and it's giving me a squiggly line because it's saying PHP Storm saying undefined variable entity manager, but we're actually requiring our bootstrap file. So we do have that entity manager variable available to us. So I'm just going to disable this inspection and also get rid of the squiggly lines here. Okay, so we'll have a quick look at the bootstrap file. As you can see, we created an entity manager object there. Okay, so it's using like a factory method here. If you recall when we worked on factory method in our design patterns, so it's using a factory method here to create us an entity manager, and then because we are including or requiring that bootstrap file in our CLI config file, we now have the entity manager available to us. And so we can actually go and run a command which will create tables from any entities that we already have in our project. We don't actually have any in our project just yet, but we can run the command and it will Doctrine will let us know that we don't actually have any entity files created yet. But just for thoroughness and to finish off this first recording, let's give this a go. So vendor bin doctrine ORM schema hyphen tool create, and then this should create us anything it needs to create. Okay, so I understand what's happened here. If we go and look at our bootstrap file, we actually said that our directory that we're going to create our mapping from will be this src directory. And so it's saying file mapping drivers must have a valid directory path. However, what's missing? We don't actually have that src folder. So in the project root, you need to create an src folder, and this is where we're going to create all of our entity classes anyway. And so src, it should be a little bit happier now. Let's go over to the terminal and run this again. Okay, great. So this is perfect. It's saying no metadata classes to process. So like I say, we've not created any entity classes just yet. We're going to do that in the next one. If you've enjoyed this video and you'd like YouTube to show you more of my content, all you need to do is subscribe and click the little notification icon. I release new recordings every few days. Details of my schedule can be found on the community tab of my YouTube channel homepage.